Welcome everyone to this session about using AJAX to extend Delphi web applications. My name is Bob Zwart and I've been using Delphi for a long time, and in this session I will show you how we can use AJAX to extend Delphi web applications. We start with a little introduction into AJAX. What is AJAX? What's the magic behind it? What it stands for. It stands for asynchronous JavaScripting and XML. Then I'll build a little example application and we'll extend it using JavaScript. And I'll show you that the core AJAX technology inside JavaScript consists of the XMLHttpRequest component, which can be used in a synchronous and asynchronous way. During this session I'll be using Delphi 2006, the Win32, personality, building a web broker application that will be used for all the examples. You can use any version of Delphi as long as it supports the web broker technology and the code editor. Then you can just play along with the example. Using Delphi, I will now create a web broker application. File, new, other, and from the web broker category we create a web server application. I'm creating a CGI standalone executable, which is the easiest to deploy and replace on this machine. I'm saving my project using webmod as name for the web module and CGI server as name for my CGI application itself. On the web module we can create several action items to respond to incoming requests. I'll create 3 for the demos of today. First one has a path info of grid, which will be used for the last example. The second one has a path info of time, which will return the current time. And the third one is the default, which will currently also return the time just as the second one. I will implement these event handlers right now. And for the second one, my response.content is colon equals to the date time to string of now. And this is the same response that I want to use for my default web action. So anyone calling this CGI application gets as response to its request the current date time. Before we can compile the application, I want to set one project option, which is my directory conditionals. I want to make sure that the output directory for my CGI server application is the CGI bin directory on my web server routes, inetpub www root CGI bin. So when I now compile my application and I run the application inside my CGI bin directory, it will automatically be able to run. I will now add an HTML page to my web application. We can do that by add new, other, going to the web documents, adding an HTML page to my CGI application. This HTML page will be saved somewhere in my virtual root. In this case, inetpub www root, and I'm calling it ajax.html. In the code editor, I will now add a little code to start my CGI application. Form action equals http localhost CGI bin CGI server.exe. Closing form tag, and inside a button input type equals submit with the value get time. If we start a browser now, showing that page, all we see is an empty form with a button get time. If I click on the get time button, the action will be executed, resulting in the time being displayed. This is the result of my response, an entire new page with the time it currently is replacing. Instead of replacing the entire page, we could also have placed a single control on the page, filling it with the information. Let's get back to the web module and add a page producer. This page producer will be used to produce a new page with the content that we're looking for, including the current time. Our HTML file should, apart from the button, now also contain an input type equals text with an ID set to time and a value set to some kind of dynamic #time value. This value will be replaced by the page producer by the actual time. In order to demonstrate that we're rebuilding pages, I want to set the background color and change it to some kind of random value. Now, going to the web module, the page producer should be using the HTML file that we just created, my AJAX.html file. And the page producer should be used by my default action. So go to the action editor, the default action. Instead of returning datetime to string, we should be using the page producer one.content here. Also, we need to implement two methods on the page producer. We need to implement the onHTML tag event handler for the time and the random tags. So in here, if tag string equals time, then replace text colon equals datetime to string of now. Otherwise, in other words, tag string equals random, then case random 6 of, let's just create a number of choices and replace text colon equals something like red, cyan, yellow, white or gray. If we compile this application, we can return to the browser, show its page, click on get time, and now we get a display with the time inside my edit box. If I click on get time again and again and again, then the background color won't change because I forget to call randomize. Going back to the web module, let's add randomize here, initialization, calling randomize to ensure we get a new random value every time we call the server. Getting back to the browser, now if we click get time, we get a new time and we also get a new background color. This is the typical behavior of a CDI application where each request results in a new page being sent back from the server to the client. Time to introduce AJAX. AJAX stands for Asynchronous, JavaScripting and XML. And the first of these four I want to start with is the JavaScripting. So let's get to Delphi, and inside my AJAX HTML file I now want to add a little JavaScripting so we can actually see what JavaScript means to us. Here's a little JavaScript template. Instead of using a submit button, we can change it to a regular button, and inside the onClick call the button demo click event handler. And button demo click in turn will use the document getElementBid to get my time edit box and set the value to now. Not really the current day time, but it will at least demonstrate that instead of calling to the server, we can use JavaScript to set any value inside this edit box. Moving to the browser, refreshing this page, if we click on get time, we get the value of now inside my edit box. And as you can see by the background color doesn't change. There are no more green progress bars here, progress blocks here. We don't get any requests back to the server. This is all JavaScript being executed inside the browser without any round tripping to the server, without any flickering or refreshing of the page. Unfortunately, we also do not see the time. So we now need to add something to the JavaScript to actually make the call to the server, but without the entire page being refreshed. So this is the plain JavaScript example. The next step is using AJAX. Not just JavaScript, but a specific AJAX class called the XMLHttpRequest component. And this one has specific capabilities. We can create an instance of the request, open a URL or a page, send the request using JavaScript without refreshing the entire page, and get a response text or response XML back inside the browser where the JavaScript can handle it and display it in the browser without the entire page being refreshed. In Delphi, this looks as follows. AJAX 1. Here we have a similar script with a button demo click. And in this case we create an instance of my XMLHttpRequest class. Unfortunately, we need two different approaches getting an instance of this class based on the type of browser that you're using. For Internet Explorer version 6, we must use the new ActiveX object in creating an instance of Microsoft.xmlhttp class. For any other browser, including Internet Explorer 7, we can just take a look at the XMLHttpRequest property of the window and create a new instance directly. It doesn't matter how you get your hands on an instance of the XMLHttpRequest. Once we have the instance, we can call the open method, call as send, and then get the response text. In this case, the open method gets three arguments. First one is either get or post. Second argument is the URL to the application that we're calling. In this case, it's my localhost bin server.exe with the path info /time. This is the one that only returns the current time. The third argument is whether or not we're calling it synchronously or asynchronously. By specifying false, we're calling it in a synchronous way. So the browser will wait for the response to arrive. When sending the request, in this case we don't send any data, so we can just leave it empty. By sending the request, we actually make a connection to the server, and the server will send the response back to us. Back into the response text or response XML property of my request, where we can use it to place inside the value of my time component. So going back to the browser, if we refresh this page again, clicking on get time, now we get the time here, the time which will be moving, actually a walking clock, without the entire page being refreshed and without the background color being refreshed. Now this is Internet Explorer version 6. Let's use Mozilla Firefox to show that the same application will work in here as well, without any changes. So single source code JavaScript, making sure that we get the correct XML HTTP request and still showing the time inside the browser when we click on the button without having to refresh the entire page. The downside of making synchronous AJAX requests is that we can potentially have to wait for the request to be fulfilled until it reaches the browser. Right now, if I click on the button, we get an immediate response. But if I go back to Delphi and add an artificial sleep of 2 seconds to my application and go back to my browser and click on get time, then the button appears to be frozen. The entire browser appears to be frozen for at least 2 seconds before we get the focus back. Same thing inside Mozilla Firefox. If we click on get time, we don't get a response until after 2 seconds, and all this time the button and the entire browser window remains disabled. Time to take a closer look at the XML HTTP request methods and properties. The method open takes 3 arguments. The method get or post, by which we call the URL or open the local file. A local file specifier or URL. Be aware that if you use a local file, then it will be cached inside your browser's cache. And a third argument, asynchronous, which is either true or false. And so far we've only used the false example using synchronous requests, which cause the delay inside the browser. So the next example will use an asynchronous request. Then sending information. This is the data that we want to post to the web server application. If it's empty, then be aware that you need to pass two single quotes inside the brackets, otherwise Firefox will not be able to handle the request. Another method, a final method, is abort. If you've been waiting too long for a request, they can always abort the request. Now for asynchronous requests, it's important to take a look at some of the properties of the XMLHttpRequest component, one of which is the onReadyStateChange event. This is an event handler which is being fired for asynchronous requests when the request is getting ready. Not especially when it's ready, but when it's getting ready. There's a ready state property which can be 0 for an uninitialized request, 1 for loading, 2 for a loaded request, 3 for interactive when it's working, and 4 when we finally received our response. And only after 4 we can actually get our hands on the response text or response XML. Apart from the ready states being 4, we should also check the status for being 200 or the status text for being 200 okay before we can actually use the response text, because maybe something bad happened along the way. To use this information in an asynchronous AJAX example, we use the same code we used before, with the difference that this time between the call to open and send, we set the onReadyStateChange event handler to some kind of callback function, and in place for the asynchronous value we say true, so we want to make an asynchronous request. Inside this callback function we can then check the request.readyState if it's equal to 4, and then the request.status if it's 200 okay, and only in that case we can use the request.responseText and assign it to the value. And the callback function can be called several seconds later, including using the artificial delay that I've just built into the example. Inside Delphi, this is the way the JavaScript looks. The button demo click, creating an instance of the request. Note that we now have to use an external variable declaration for my request, initializing it to null. Creating an instance of the request the usual way, opening using get my CGI server executable with /time, this time passing true for my asynchronous request as third argument. The callback function is called timeReady. Then we send an empty request, and just before we return, we set the getElementById of time, set it to a value of working. So while waiting for the answer, we get the text working on screen. Inside my timeReady callback function, we check the ready states as well as the status, and if they're both okay, then we set the value to time. If we check this inside the browser, if we refresh the browser window here, click on get time, we see the value of working for 2 seconds, and in the meantime we can select texts, use other controls, the button is no longer depressed, and after 2 seconds we get our response. Same thing again with Firefox. If we refresh the page working, we can select any text. The browser is no longer frozen, and this is the major benefit of asynchronous JavaScript requests, when you can continue working, enter other values in other controls, while behind the scenes all kinds of JavaScript requests are going on, sending information back to the browser where it can be handled and displayed on screen. So far I've been using input type equals text edit controls with an ID in my browser window, in my HTML form, where I have to use the document getElementById and set the value of these text box controls. This was nice for demos, but in practical situations it's easier and nicer to replace sections which are otherwise invisible, so-called div controls. In that case we have to use the inner HTML. So we can create a div with the ID, in this case ID equals time, with a closing div statement, use the same document.getElements by ID with the same time value, but then use the inner HTML as target to assign the response text to, so we can show the contents on screen. Going back to Delphi, we can change that, so instead of using my input type is text, we can actually make it into a div ID equals time with a closing div statement, remove the input type is text, and we can here add the hash time so it works with the previous example as well, although we don't use the page producer anymore, so remove that one. Remove the hash random and just give it a nicer color on screen. The form action itself is also no longer needed because we're no longer calling our web server application using the form. We are actually just using a div and a button demo click to fill my div control on screen. The change that I said, we can no longer use the value property, but we now have to use inner HTML in this place as well as this place. So right now, if we save this and go to my browser, if we refresh the window, we no longer see my edit box with the value. However, if I click on the button, we still get the get time. We get working, and after a while my div is filled with the actual value of the current time. Same thing again with Firefox. If we refresh the page, get time, still empty, click on the button, working, and after 2 seconds of an artificial delay, we get the current time. One place where the use of these div controls can be especially helpful is when creating a combination of AJAX with a web broker CGI application. In this case, I want to use a DataSetTable producer connecting to the ADO Northwind database to select a number of fields from the employees table. In fact, I want to select the employee ID, first name, last name, city and country. And inside the where clause, I want to use 4 possible arguments, values that I send to this query to filter the selection and then order the results by the employee ID. Let's first build the CGI application for this particular action inside Delphi and then get back to the JavaScript and see how we can connect to it using AJAX. Inside Delphi, our page producer, we start with placing an ADO connection component on my web module. Using this ADO connection component, I can edit my connection string and build it to make a connection to SQL Server, in this case on my local machine, using a specific username and of course secret password, selecting the Northwind database, testing the connection, and we can make a successful connection using these settings. This makes my connection string, and if I say OK now, let's set the login prompt to false to ensure that my web server application will not get the login prompt. And now adding an ADO dataset component, connecting the dataset to my ADO connection and specifying my SQL command in the command text property. Login failed. I thought of course we should allow saving of the password. And again enter my SQL text. Select employee ID, first name, last name, city and country from the employees table, where first name like colon first name, that's a parameter, and last name like colon last name, and city like colon city, and country like colon country. Order by employee ID. Okay. We should activate the dataset at design time to see if we made a typing mistake, and indeed I did. So let's check the last name. Here we are, last name. Okay. Activate it again, and now we can activate my ADO dataset. With this ADO dataset, we can use a DataSetTable producer to connect to and show the results inside my browser. Keeping it active at design time allows me to get a better view of the response editor and how the result will look like. Assuming we connect my DataSetTable producer to my ADO dataset. Inside the response editor, here we have a view of all my table columns inside my cell. And we can set the background color to yellow, for example, change the border of the table. And for each individual cell we can use the object inspector to set specific colors, alignments, titles like employee ID. We can set a title to just ID, and for first name we can change the background color to red, and for city we can change the background color to silver, and anything you like. Let's take lime as well. Okay, so this will be a nice display of the results. Let's close my response editor. Now close my dataset at design time, so at least the project can be opened at design time even on another machine. Go back to the action editor and remember that I created my web action item for the /grid. Now all we need to do is go to the onAction event handler and in here say response.content : equals DataSetTableProducer1.content. We can recompile the application, and all we need to do now is get back to our HTML file, AJAX HTML, to write the JavaScript to handle this particular event. Back in our AJAX HTML file, the first thing we need to do is add a little table with 4 fields: first name, last name, city and country, and 4 edit controls. Input type equals text for text box first name, text box last name, text box city and text box country, as well as a new button, input type equals button, with caption value is filter and on click button filter click. So if we view this in the browser, it will be shown as this with my first name, last name, city and country and a button filter, and if you click on filter then something will happen and we will see the response of this click inside the browser. The question is, where will this appear? Going back to Delphi, right between the table and the input or after the input, we can create another div statement, div id equals grid with a closing div. And this is the place where we can place the content, the result of our filter command. The code for the actual button filter click is as follows. Just a copy of the button demo click. In this case, button filter click creates the request in the usual way. It opens a request to the get and the localhost CDI bin CDI server exe/grid, again with the asynchronous request. On ready state change, this time calling the grid ready callback function, which we'll get to in a moment. And for the first time we are actually passing information in the send method. In this case, a field with the name tb first name equals and then the value of the field name, the value that we entered in that edit control document get element by id tb first name dot value. Remember, it's a text control, so we have to use the dot value. Last name also document get element by id last name dot value, same with city and country. Adding these 4 fields with ampersands between the first and the second one, second and third and fourth field, adding it to my post information that we are sending to the server. Then we set our div with the id grid to working and get ready for the filter to operate. Inside my grid ready callback function, if the ready state equals 4, if the work is done and the status is 200 OK, we replace the content of the grid's inner HTML by our response text, which should be the contents of our DataSetTable producer. So, with everything almost done, we can compile the application, go to the browser and refresh it, click on my filter link, and we get an empty table here. That's because all my filters are empty, and Also because in my event handler we didn't actually use the values that we entered in the text boxes here and assign them to the parameters of my ADO dataset. So we need to get back to Delphi and fix that in the Delphi source code now. Back in Delphi, in the code editor, we need to write some code for the action item just before we use the DataSetTable user1.content. In here we need to set the parameters of the ADO dataset. So ADO dataset1 parameters, parent by name being first name dot value colon equals, and I'm going to use the percent to make sure that even empty arguments, even empty parameter values will match all records. We are sending information using the POST protocol, so we need to use the request.contentFields.values, in this case tb first name, and then again add a percent character. We can copy this and instead of first name also add it for last name, and of course for city, and finally for country. This will set the 4 parameters of my ADO dataset. If we now compile the application, go back to the browser, refresh it in the window and click on the filter, without having specified any filter expressions for first name, last name, city and country, we get every value from the grid. But if I specify that first name should contain an O and country should contain a U, for example, clicking on filter, we get only first names with an O and country with a U. Or we can specify that the first name should be an O and the last name should be an A, and then we get another filter, or first name should always be Bob, or whatever. The downside is that every time when we change a filter, even if we change something that doesn't match, we still need to click on the filter button in order to send that request back to the server. Wouldn't it be nice to just type something and when you're done typing have the filter automatically execute and send the request to the server, in the background of course, asynchronously, while we are typing something else in other controls? Yes, that would be nice, and it's also possible using AJAX of course. The solution for this can be found in the onKeyDown event that JavaScript adds to text controls, input controls, which we can hook to a key click event, like I've shown here on the slide. Inside this key click, apart from using the request event, the request variable, we also use a timer. And when the user is happily typing away, each key click will actually create a timer, create a new, clear the previous timer and set a new timeout of 500 milliseconds or half a second. And if the user doesn't type a new character within that half a second time frame, then the event load table, the function load table, will be fired. Inside load table, of course, the timer should be cleared to avoid any subsequent calls of load table while the user is still typing away. Using this request and timer combination, especially the timer, make sure that the user will not be having a load table event triggered while he's still typing in a filter expression, but once he's finished typing, or at least finished typing for more than half a second, then the timer will be triggered and then the load table function will be called, executing the filter behind the scenes. So as I will demonstrate shortly, you can continue typing, but once you're done, then the actual event will be triggered. Going back to Delphi, this means we need to add a timer field variable, assign it to null, as well as a function key click. And we will add the key click to our edit buttons in a minute. And this key click function should first check if the timer is not equal to null and then clear the timer and create a new one. Time is set timeout, calling my button filter click in this case with a 500 millisecond delay. Inside my button filter click, apart from creating a new request, the first thing we should do is clear the timer and set the timer to null to make sure that any subsequent filter click calls will not accidentally activate the timer again. Going all the way down to my table, we should now set the onKeyClick event handler, onKeyDown event handler to my keyClick method, including the semicolon, and adding the onKeyDown to all 4 text boxes in my table. So for all 4 text boxes, if the user is typing away text, they will trigger the keyClick event because of their onKeyDown, which will set a timer which after 500 milliseconds of without another key click will activate my button filter click. We don't have to recompile because I only changed some JavaScript code, but we can go to the browser, refresh the page and start typing like an O, and after half a second it should have fired. The problem was caused by me calling the method clearTimerOut, which should be clearTimeout. So after making that fix, going back to the browser, refreshing and now typing an O in my first name, then after half a second typing an O in first name, we have the filter of Bob, OB, Bob, and I can actually type in anything, and while I'm typing the filter won't be working. Only when I stop typing for half a second the filter is activated. Same with the last name, I can start to type something, and as long as I keep pressing keys, anything will happen, nothing will happen, but as soon as I release a key for more than half a second, then the filter will be operating. So now we've got nothing left if I type in anything or leave it, or now we got something left or not. Okay, so this clearly shows how we can use a combination of a timer and the requests to make sure that as long as we type, nothing will happen, but as soon as we stop typing, a filter will be activated on the table, showing only the records that you want to see. And this technique can be applied to any application, not just the web broker application with the DataSetTable producer that I've used here. We can also use AJAX for validation, where a client-side change can trigger a specific function to validate the value entered in that particular control, like an edit box. For this example, an input type equals text with a specific ID, TB first name. In the onChange, I can call the validate, passing the name of that control. Now onChange is an event which is triggered when we leave the focus of a control of the edit box. This means if I click on the tab key to tab to another edit box, or if I click with the mouse inside another edit box so the focus is lost, then my onChange method will be called. Inside the validate method, valid here is the name of my control, so I can use the same function to validate multiple controls. We open a request with the post method, calling cgi-bin cgi-server.exe with a new action item /valid with an asynchronous request. The already state change is set to validate ready, and I'm sending in my post response valid, the name of my control, plus the escaped value of my get element by ID valid.value. And this actual value is the value inside my edit control. So with this information I can send a validation request back to the server as soon as I leave an edit control or get the focus in another control. Inside my function validate ready, I will now look at the response, which at this time is no longer an HTML response but will be an XML response. So back at the server side, instead of producing HTML, which the browser can display inside a inner HTML tag, for example of a div control or in the value of an edit control, this time we generate an HTML document. HTML document consisting of a number of nodes, a validation node with 2 subnodes, a valid node with either true or false to specify if the contents, the value of the named control is actually valid or not. And in case it's not valid, so in case valid has the value false, we should also have an error subnode with an invalid error message. A message like your first name cannot contain any numbers, or your phone number cannot contain any letters, or other specific error messages you want to give to the user. Now inside my validate ready function, we should use the request.responseXML value at this time and not responseHTML. Get elements by tag name and take a look at my arrow node, the arrow node here. And if it exists, we should use the first child.node value from the arrow node to get to the error message and be able to display that error message on screen. The complete JavaScript is as follows. Here's my function validate, with valid being the name of the control that we want to validate. First we have the usual code to create a request object, and then we open a request using the post protocol this time to /cgibin cgiserver.exe/valid, passing through for an asynchronous request. The onReady state change is this time set to validate ready, the callback function here below. And then we send the name of my valid control equals and then the escape value of my document get element by ID valid dot value. So we actually pass the value of my control equal to the name of the control to the server, so the server can validate the value connected to the name of the control. That we will see in a minute. Once the validation has been done, then validate ready will get the XML document in return this time, checking ready state and status, and we need to take a look at the request.responseXML, see if there's an element by tag name with the name error. And if that element has been found with a length bigger than 0, meaning there is at least a node called error inside my XML document, then we can get this element by ID on my form, on my HTML form, and fill the inner HTML with it by the actual first child's node value of the error XML node. So there's a div error on my HTML form, and there's an error node in my XML document that I'm using to put an error message on screen. Otherwise, if there's no error node inside my XML document, I just clear the error div on my screen by setting the inner HTML to an empty string. Now if you scroll below, then you notice that just above this table I've entered a div control, div ID equals error with a closing div statement. This div will usually be invisible, and it's only visible once it has been filled with an error, in this case once a validation has failed. Now I want to test the validation for two controls, for first name and last name. So at the end of this inputs type equals text ID is tb first name, on key down is key click. We can add another event, the on change equals validate, passing the name tb first name as argument. You can actually copy this code and also paste it for the last name to make sure that in the onChange event for my last name text control, we call the validate method, in this case passing the name tb last name. And these two controls will now be validated, and we can, in the web module, create a method to validate the names and the contents of these controls and see if they're actually valid values. Back on the web module, we should add a new action item, this time with the path info /valid, and implement the onAction event handler to handle the validation of our input controls. First of all, we need to define some local variables to hold the value of the first name and last name fields that we pass to our onAction item here. By default, we assume that everything is still valid, but we need to compare each character to see if it's indeed valid. Now the first thing we need to do here is to set the response.content type to text/XML. By default, a response.content type is text HTML, but this time we need to return an XML document, so we need to set the response.content type accordingly. Then we can start to set the response.content itself, starting with the validation node, the validation XML node. And at the end of my event handler, I should add the closing validation node, so response.content colon equals response.content slash validation. In here we should perform the actual validation and create the valids and optionally the error node. So again, let's by default assume everything is valid and check the values of first name or last name, which are either of the fields have been passed to our on action item. Since we don't know if it's the first name or the last name field plus value which has been passed, let's retrieve just both of them. So first name colon equals request dot content fields dot values of tb first name, and last name colon equals request dot content fields dot values of tb last name. Now, if first name is not an empty string, then we can start to compare first name. So for each character in my first name, I want to see if the character is inside letters or an empty space, for example. So if C in A to Z or the space character, and let's use the uppercase value of C, and if that's not the case, then valid equals false. Otherwise, we still have a valid character, a letter, or an empty space. At the end, if not valid, then we need to create an error node. So response.content colon equals response.content plus, first of all, my valid node, valid with false, and followed by the error node, which is an error message, first name can only contain letters or spaces, and the closing error node. Otherwise, if we are still valid, then we can say response.content colon equals response.content plus my valid node passing through inside the valid node. Okay. If the first name is not empty, then we should check the last name. Check last name. But perhaps last name is also empty, and perhaps we want to use this to check more controls. So we should actually check if last name is not empty. So I'm copying all this code here, and if first name is not empty, let's say if last name is not empty, then for C in last name do valid equals false. If not valid, then say last name can only contain letters or an empty space. And we can add other validations here for phone numbers or postal codes or whatever you want. The minimum age before someone is allowed to use Delphi, that should be the age of 2 or something like that. Any validations can be added here, followed by the response content of the closing validation node. Compiling this event handler, then returning to my page, performing a refresh on my page. Typing something in my first name will execute the filter. Typing a digit in the first name as well, the filter will still work, filtering and showing no records left. If I use tab or my mouse to click on another record, another edit field, then my onChange event will trigger and then the validation will happen. And now we get a validation error because first name can only contain letters or spaces, and I typed in the digit 9. So if we go back and type any letters and clear it, then the error is cleared as well. As soon as I start to type digits, then we get the error message. Same with last name. And if we replace this with characters, then the validation will be valid again and the error message will be cleared. That's one thing you may notice is the error messages, the errors is shared in the same div. So if first name is invalid and last name is valid, if we exit the last name, for example with the tab key, then the actual error is cleared again. So you may want to use different error messages right next to these edit controls if you want to make sure that all errors are still visible at the same time. I hope that I've been able to show you what AJAX is all about and how we can use the AJAX techniques, especially the XMLHttpRequest technologies inside Delphi web applications. For more references, I recommend reading the Delphi magazine issue 123 for a nice article to beef up web applications with the XMLHttpRequest component, with different demos but the similar technologies used in this session. Also, you could take a look at my AJAX enabled eco-asp.net weblog, available on the internet as bobswart.nl/blog, where you can actively see my weblog in action, including AJAX filters to filter on the topics, and you can leave comments or ask new questions. A number of articles describing how to create that eco weblog can be found on http://www.drbob42.com/eco. Here you can find several articles on eco-asp.net, in the last one containing information on AJAX enabling my weblog. The source code for all examples shown in this session and coded live will be available for download on my website as well. You can download them right now at http://www.drbob42.com/ajax, and the source code will be marked as being for this CodeRage session. Now, I can understand if you have any questions left. If you want to reach me after the session, I believe there are some Skype or chat sessions scheduled, so you can always try to reach me using Skype. I'm Skype handle ebob42 or drbob42. Or you can try to email me at one of the hopefully well-known email addresses. Let me know if you have some comments or other experiences or perhaps problems using AJAX to extend Delphi web applications. I've been using it some time, and as you can see, you can use it in different ways for filters or validation or just any type of application that you wish. With that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm sure we'll see each other shortly using the Skype technology or by email or any other means. Anyway, thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you next time.